For the second part of our lesson today, we're going to talk about the Mariners storyland. And one of the key questions becomes then, how did the host culture's storyland impact their particular lives? It's interesting. Chick-fil-A, at least they used to, I'm not sure if they still do, but they used to talk about to their employees that every person who comes in, every life that comes through that door right there has a story behind them. And they would give examples. There's a single mother trying to make ends meet. There's a person who just lost his job and wondering what's the future hold for him, and or an elderly lady who just lost her husband. So every person that comes through that door has a story. So you want to be cognizant of who you're trying to deal with here as a employee of Chick-fil-A. And it's a great way of approaching it. Some of the types of narratives that we could look for then, and you have biographies, you have life writing, you have life histories, life stories, you've got ethnobiographies, you've got ethno-histories, you've got all kinds of things. We have face stories we looked at last week, and different ways of accumulating stories about people. I want to look at just two of them today, and it'll take us into some other areas as well. But one of them is life stories. And so among the people that you're familiar with in your new culture, how well do you know their life stories? And if you ask for them, you're going to get basically, you'll start to find out who they are in society, where they relate, their social status and so forth. You're going to get to learn about what Victor Turner called social dramas. And those are incidents in their lives that have happened. And those are usually crisis situations that have taken place. You're going to find out then too about who are the primary and the periphery people that have impacted their life, that have come on their stage and have influenced them one way or the other, good or bad, or in between. And so that's one thing we can look for is life stories and start to collect them from our audience to get to know them. Another type is life histories. This is more involved, and this will take them through the entire life series, and it's going to be recorded probably, done over time, and probably then edited by the interviewer and all put back together. And what would they collect out of that? What would they look for? You can go from birth to childhood to adolescence to adulthood to death, and post-death for some societies, of course. And then before that, some societies would include pre-birth. So it depends on who you're talking to, what the cultural backgrounds are. But life histories are another way of collecting and preserving, actually, what's happened to a particular person. It's interesting, Samson is the only judge we have in Scripture that we are told the whole story from birth to death. From birth to death, we get his story. So then why should we collect these stories? Either life stories or oral histories. Why would we spend the time to do that? And I think this is where we find out that every culture is socialized different, and even within cultures there are subcultures as well, right? So they are socialized in different ways, and they are different people because of that. And I think one of the great things about when we talked about how do we present ourselves as a teacher, a lawyer, or a doctor, or something of that way, this helps us to build relationships with these people by doing this. This makes us a learner, which then gets us into a trader. We can trade our stories back and forth. And what it does then, it also provides immortality for these people, for their families. They can preserve what has happened in their lives and so forth. Before my mother passed, she spent hours and hours and hours and then typed up all the history that she knew of going back to her grandparents and great grandparents and so forth, to leave that for us so that we would have that. And so we have now things that I had never heard before, things I knew before but knew them wrongly. And so that preserves a lot of our history, our family history, because of that. So we're very appreciative. And she typed that, and that means like one finger at a time. That's how she typed. And it also offers, when you're asking for their history like that, their life history, it gives them opportunity to reflect on it and maybe even repair it as they tell you that story. As Rico said one time in one of his books, he said, a life narrated is a life examined. And that's what it does. So not only do you get information, they get to relive their life and examine their life and make changes if so needed. Another fallout of this is that every society has what we call master narratives. And so one of the things that you'll want to do is not only collect their life stories, but also see if you can find out what their master narratives are. Let me read you this one. On October 6, 1981, Lieutenant Khalid Ismailui, leader of the plot to assassinate President Anwar Sadat, leaped from his passing military truck and ran towards the stands where dignitaries were viewing the parade. He and his 3 collaborators lobbed grenades towards the Egyptian president and discharged their weapons. After finishing firing his assault weapon at Sadat, he cried out, "I have killed the Pharaoh." Sadat was shot 37 times. 40 people were killed or wounded. But why did he shout out, "I have killed the Pharaoh"? That's a master narrative in the Egyptian world. So what is it? If you define it, and this comes from the book Master Narratives of Islamic Extremism, he calls it this, actually there are multiple authors here, a trans-historical narrative that is deeply embedded in a particular culture. And the Pharaoh narrative is one of those master narratives that's embedded deeply in the Egyptian psyche. And some more present ones that we might have, I can remember when the People Power movement took place in 1986 in the Philippines, in Manila, and Mary was honored in that. And the cross streets, there was a big statue built of her there in commemorating that. And so if you talk to Filipinos, they will know about the People Power movement. That was when Marcos was trying to be overthrown at that particular time, and it actually worked. And he was escorted to Hawaii by the U.S. One night, and the change of power happened in the Philippines because of that. So that's one of the master narratives of the Philippines. And FDR made this statement, "A day which will live in infamy." And that, of course, is when Pearl Harbor was attacked by Japanese at the beginning of World War II. And 9/11 is going to be one of our master narratives here in the United States, has to be. Or Martin Luther King and those civil rights movement back in the 60s, where he wanted the color of their skin not to be what was important, but the character of their conduct. That's what he would do. So that's one of those master narratives that drive the United States. Argentina, you will talk about the dirty war, or the disappeared ones. And I've been there, and you see pictures on the walls of just hundreds and hundreds of people who disappeared during that dirty war. So those would be some of the master narratives that are out there. And for Israel, what would be a couple of stories that would be central with the master narratives for them? And one, it's going to go back to creation, and two, it's going to be the Exodus story. Those are two biggies for Israel. And in Christianity, what were some of the big stories for us? It's going to be the crucifixion, it's going to be the resurrection, right? But to show you some variables in that, in the Western perspective of the resurrection and so forth, what do we think about? We think about, well, and you look at the pictures that are drawn, the artwork associated with the resurrection, and what is it? It's always, I've never seen any different. It's always Jesus alone coming out of the tomb, resurrecting, and so forth. A singular perspective. It's interesting, though, in the Eastern world, many of them see the resurrection as not just Jesus alone, but with many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. So actually, they're more scriptural than some in the West, because it talks about Jesus, yes, resurrected, but also all these other bodies. The resurrection is in what? The collective restoration of humanity to glory. So different perspectives on the meta narrative or the master narrative, depending on where you come from. It's the same story, resurrection, right? But different aspects of that master narrative. Why are these so important? Because what do? They basically give us legitimacy to our culture. They say this is why we do what we do. They connect the past to the present. They connect our behavior to that past and makes it legitimate. So, and they also give us a future hope. We have a hope. When we think about Revelation, the book of Revelation, how does that end of that master narrative give us hope? It's all right there. So, how well do you know the master narratives of the host culture that you're working among? How well do you know their life stories? Okay, so let's have a little breakout here and let's discuss that. Discuss the meta-narratives that you've discovered and give us some of the highlights of some of the life stories that you have collected from the people that you work among.